Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from... My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome lawyer and self-described independent metaphysician Benebell Wen. Benebell is the author of Holistic Tarot and The Tao of Craft. Benebell, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Gordon.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to traditional question number one. Benebell, were you a weird kid?
I was a very weird kid. I think that pretty much, I didn't have to answer that question. Everyone sort of knows if you're into this kind of thing, you were probably a weird one.
No, for sure. I think if you end up on this show, that tends to be the case as well. Can you give us some specifics? Did you live in a haunted house? Did you live in a tree house?
No, I did not live in a haunted house, but I pretended that I did. So I would lie to my little sister and tell her that all of these various ghosts haunted our homes. I don't know if that counts or if that just completely discredited me. But basically I was into the paranormal. What was real is my family believed very strongly in ghosts, hungry ghosts and spirits, hauntings and things like that. So when I went back to Taiwan, they would legitimately say certain homes that we owned were haunted by certain spirits, whatnot. So that was allegedly real. I was that kid who always went to the library, the occult section of the library.
Yeah,
and
it's also called the stolen book section where I grew up.
Yes. I would go to the occult section of the public library and pretty much read everything there and then have nothing else to read because there was only, 5 books there. So that was the kind of child I was.
I see. It's interesting. I tried to pretend to my little brother that our house was haunted growing up as well. But unfortunately, he's quite clairvoyant, so that got real quite quickly.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. So when you're talking about houses in Taiwan, were there, and this is the culture that your family is in, what kind of things did they do about it? Like, do you have good sort of exorcism or banishing stories that you remember from your childhood?
I was never personally witness to one because when I was present, they'd always tell me it was positive. So, for example, this is horrible, actually. My grandfather had a mistress and then she passed on at the home. And so they would say that the ghost of the mistress was still around, but she was friendly. She, was peaceful. So that was told to me. My mother would always tell me stories about how one of my uncles was possessed. And again, these are allegations, right? She would allege that one of my uncles was possessed and that there were certain exorcisms performed on him by various witch doctors. So I've heard stories like that were really close to the family, but personally never witnessed.
And in terms of your sort of published work to date, it kind of runs the gamut from Western esoteric tradition to Taoist spirit practices and so on. So from a kid, was there one that particularly resonated with you? Was there something where you're like, actually, I'm gonna really double down on astrology or the tarot or what have you?
It was the tarot, and I think I was raised in suburbia here in the United States where I was basically the only Asian kid. So I think I was trying very desperately to fit in, and having all of this like Taoist sorcery was really not the way to fit in suburban America. And so I shied very far away from my heritage and my roots and tried to sort of conform to the world around me, but I still had this innate interest and fascination for, the occult and the paranormal. So I think my way to get that fix was through tarot and through studying more Western mystery traditions. And then I think recently I became more attuned with my family and feeling like it's okay to sort of revisit what was always part of me and not reject it. And then I started developing more academic interests in esoteric Taoism.
Yeah, it's funny how the world changes because you'd be the popular kid now if you're like, my family owns haunted houses and so on. It would be the popular thing to have happen.
Right. Oh, I was born in a different time, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right, so that kind of brings up, I'd like to actually, what was your first tarot deck? Let's go there first.
So I think the first tarot deck was a gift. It was the Tarot Nova but I couldn't read it. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. So immediately following, so basically really close to the Tarot Nova, I got myself the Rider-Waite, the yellow box 1971 Rider-Waite.
Yes, we're familiar. We're familiar with it around here.
Are you?
Yeah.
It's like the only deck you can buy in many, many stores.
Yes, I was as a kid in a newsagents here in regional Australia. It was there, and I said, "Mum, can I have this?" And she's like, "No, you can't have that." So it's always been like the missed opportunity for me. I now have loads of tarot decks, but it was the one that you could get at a newsagents in regional Australia.
What was your first tarot deck?
My first non-clandestinely owned tarot deck was the Merlin Tarot,
Oh,
which I didn't resonate with.
uh-huh.
But one of the sort of soonish after that, because I knew I was in the right like mythos, I got the Arthurian Tarot. And I
Oh,
must have got that when I was 15, and I turned 36 this year, and I'm still using that exact same deck. So, yes, that was a good call.
oh, good one. Are you more of so then you're Rider-Waite Smith, right? The Arthurian Tarot is sort of
Oh yeah,
Rider-Waite.
sure. It's based on that.
Okay.
It's based on that format. My more regular ones at the moment are Marseille and Solabusca. But if I'm doing readings, usually when it happens, if I have friends over and there's been some wine, I'm like, I don't want to do anything intense, so I just sort of I fall back on ones that I can literally do drunk out of my skull.
Yeah. Nice, nice. Yes, I agree with that one. I can definitely read with the Rider-Waite Smith when I'm drunk out of my skull.
Yeah, that's it's what it's for. I'm sure that's what they meant when they were putting it together.
I thought so.
Cool. So you had you have a career that doesn't necessarily go in this direction. So was this something that you kind of followed academically when you went into university, or is this something that has moved from like hobby to second career?
It's moved from hobby to second career recently, but it's always been part of my life. I can't remember a time when, um, you know, working with the tarot, dabbling in various forms of divination, reading books on the occult, whether it's more serious, antiquated text or just modern, light, fluffy stuff. Like I ran the whole gamut, but I can't remember a time in my life that I wasn't connected to this part of myself. I think it's only in very recent years when I was sort of thrust into the limelight that I became more public about it.
Right. And here's something that I was sort of thinking about as I was reading the latest book. Do you think Do you think you went at it in the right sequence? Do you think your understanding of tarot was helpful when it came to exploring esoteric Taoism and Fu sigils and so on?
I don't think so. I think it was very different. For example, I mean, there's a lot of similarities, which I think is why I found it so fascinating, why I was so passionate about it, because there was so many synchronicities and sort of congruency between the various systems. But, I think having right from the beginning this concept of the four alchemical elements that is the sort of core of tarot structure, and then having the five wuxing elements and the eight bakwa as the Eastern one. I mean, there's a disconnect there. I think it does take a little bit of intellectual acrobatics to reconcile between those two systems. So it didn't really help, but I think it gave me the confidence to tackle the more esoteric topics in Eastern mystery traditions.
Gotcha, confidence. Because I guess what I was thinking more was that it's it's squiggles on paper, whether it's tarot cards or Fu sigils, and their potency and their use. And I was just wondering if that was maybe if there's like a tactile component to it.
I think what's more interesting is so the heritage I grew up in, the way it was a very strong oral tradition. And so a lot of how it was taught is in maxims and absolutism. So you must do it this way. There's a lot of orthodoxy involved. Whereas I think with tarot, it taught me to have a more fluid and open and more liberal conception of craft. And then I brought that more liberal conception of craft into esoteric Taoism, which traditionally is actually quite orthodox.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start there because that's kind of getting close to some of the questions, and it will start with an easy one. What is Daoism? And And what kind of state is it in sort of mainland China today? Because the first part of the book, I think, has some really enlightening history in it that really filled in some gaps for me. But like, let's go, Benebell, with what is Taoism?
What is Taoism? I think the funny thing is, whenever you read academic texts on Taoism, they always talk extensively about how it can't be defined and how difficult it is to sort of cohesively express what Taoism is. But I think essentially it's the path that you take to reach a level of, I would say, ascension, sort of connecting to your higher self, basically the path you take to be spiritually enlightened, so to speak, you know. In religious Taoism, they would talk about immortality. So that was sort of the religious facet where they believed if you cultivated yourself enough, you would be able to become an ascended master. So there's that religious aspect of it, but it's the path. And they're sort of embedded into this idea of Taoism is that your path, Gordon, is going to be different from my path. And so we really can't, you know, define what Taoism is through our subjective lens. We just have to have this sort of universal understanding that each person, to each their own, so to speak.
Yeah, it's and I guess to put some practical bits in there for people, it is a lot of it is a Neolithic survival, which is rare in the world. So you're dealing with a, particularly when you get into the sort of folk Taoist areas, you're dealing with spirits and ancestors and an animate world in which you operate, and so it's kind of like it's sort of the word for the world, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. So part of religious Taoism is this very, I mean, you see it in Shintoism as well, this concept of spirit, you know, that runs through all the metaphysical dimension to all physical objects. So there is this idea that a mountain will have a spirit, a stone, a tree, all of these facets of nature have spirits. And you want to sort of live in alignment with these spirits. So one of the core principles of Taoist is Wu Wei, which is non-harm and to not to live in harmony with the spirit world around you.
I like that. I like that. And what kind of state is it in? This surprised me. What kind of state is it in, particularly in China at the moment, and sort of how long has that been going on?
Well, the Ming Dynasty was when you really saw, was it? Yeah, I think Ming Dynasty was when it started having a decline. And then by the Qing Dynasty, so just to give you a reference, that's 1600s to 1900s, you're entering about close to modern China, is when the Chinese really started thinking more in terms of atheism, nationalism, and also science. They really wanted to sort of push science to the forefront. And because a lot of the way you see how Taoism is practiced, it's very religious, it's very superstitious. Taoist sorcery, there's magic involved. There's a lot of bells and whistles that really can't be explained in a matter of fact way by science. So they try to distance themselves away from that. And then, of course, you had the Cultural Revolution when anything that was sort of part of old China was destroyed. And Taoism is about as part of old China as it gets because it goes back to the Neolithic period of China. That's about 10,000 BC. So they really, you saw the Red Guards and communists really sort of denounce and denigrate Taoism, especially Taoist magic. There was a lot of book burning, and I believe a couple of these seminal texts in Taoism, there's only one copy left. That's quite a tragedy. And so it really people didn't really talk about being Taoist. And then you have a lot of Taoist magic being practiced in, say, Hong Kong and Taiwan and a lot of the Chinese diasporas around Southeast Asia. But I think there's still that sort of stigma attached to being Taoist. So a lot of people are actually Taoist, but they will actually say they're Buddhist.
Yeah, it's got a sort of country bumpkin superstition attached to it, which I think is very
Mhm.
sad. And I think that the book paints that story that it's. I mean, we can certainly blame the communists for a lot, but the kind of hit was taken out a couple of centuries ago, and it's been in a decline in mainland China since then. Which is just for people who listen to this show who are mostly non-Chinese. That it's just one of those. What are you doing? What are you doing? You have a 10,000-year-old tradition.
It is very sad. And the funny thing is, Taoism is such an integral part of our culture. All of our holidays are based on the lunisolar calendar. The pagan concepts of Taoism is such a part of even today, what we do today, the Lunar New Year, how we, the ghost month, all of the facets of everyday life and holidays is based on Taoist history, but we just basically erase the Taoist part and just talk about the sort of cultural iconography. And the history very much parallels Western paganism, I find, where you keep sort of the markers of the tradition, but you erase the pagan facet of it, the pagan identity, and you just sort of keep that, practice, like the
Right.
Christmas tree.
And so the book we're talking about is The Tao of Craft, through talismans and casting sigils in the Eastern esoteric tradition. So, Benebell, what are Fu sigils?
Oh, Fu sigils. Well, let me start here. It's a form of writing, and the reason writing is considered so magical and why any practitioner of magic or Taoist sorcery would need to master this form of writing is this idea that there's this Chinese saying where when humankind invented writing, the demons shook in fear. And this is sort of this core concept in the culture. And that's because once humans were able to write and became literate, we were able to communicate with the gods and we were able to identify the names of demons, the sorcery, all of that. And that's all based on writing. So, because of that, you have this idea of imperial decrees in, how emperors back then to issue decrees, they wrote their decrees down. So, Fu talismans, the most traditional ones, were based on imperial decrees. The emperor, instead of having the emperor, would be the deities or divinity, and the practitioner would be the officiate who's creating the decree to command a particular spirit or command a particular demon.
The status of the emperor. I mean, if you go back to historic Taoism, where you have yellow emperor and so on, this is a either wholly mythical or semi mythical person imbued with supernatural powers. So even if the decree is coming from a human, it's still a magical act. The emperor, by virtue of being emperor, uh, issues this decree, and the spirit world responds.
Yeah, Fuxi is another one, King Wen, Yellow Emperor. So all of the earliest emperors in Chinese history is really, I mean, historians debate whether or not they existed or whether or not it's just sort of, they've been imbued with these, supernatural powers over the centuries. But yeah, they're very much mythologized and they are all shamans. They all know magic. They can all, transform into mythical beasts and all of that.
It's interesting. I like that when man invented writing, the demon shook in fear, because I gave a presentation at the occult conference in London last year, and it was about the emergence of symbolic thinking in humans. So
Mm.
in Africa, 300,000 years ago, give or take. Uh, and if you look at what Mircea Eliade said about creation myths, that when you find them in shamanic or animistic or indigenous cultures around the world, by and large, they are dealing with the fact that we as humans have a different way, a different mental mode, a different inner life than a different inner life rather than we're the exclusive holders of it, which is what the Europeans got wrong. A different inner life to the rest of the universe, essentially. And a lot of that is tied up in the idea of writing. Like symbolic thinking is the thing that marks us out because we can have a thing represent another thing. So whilst there is tool use in the natural kingdom, like using sticks to get ants and so on, they don't think the stick is a fire engine. So they don't actually have that literally magical power of symbolic thinking, which writing is the, highest
Yeah.
manifestation of. And it's really interesting because the demons shook in fear at the creation of writing. They can't do it. Here is this immensely powerful act of symbolizing, and I love that is retained at the kind of beginning of the sort of Fu sigil story.
Yeah, and so a lot of so I know, for example, sigil crafting in Western traditions is one form of magic, right? You could potentially practice, you could use sigils as a spell and sort of use it in an isolated way. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, sigils are part and parcel to every form of craft. So no matter what you're doing, at some point in that ritual or that process, there's going to be a sigil involved.
So let's give some examples. So do you use Fu sigils to like summon a spirit?
Yes. So I guess practical ones that I would see that are still going on today in Taiwan is forms of faith healing. So if, for example, modern medicine couldn't cure something, you would go see a witch doctor, a shaman, somebody, a Taoist priest or priestess, and they would craft a sigil, a food talisman, and use that to quote unquote cure you. And so there are different forms. They could either burn it into ashes, mix it with other herbs, and tell you to drink it, or they tell you to bathe in it. Like it dissolves in water, and you're supposed to take a bath in that. But basically, it's still used as a form of magic. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, you said it would be for summonings and for evocations and all of that as well. For anything that anytime the human wants to interact with the spirit world, you interact with the spirit world through a food talisman.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned in the book, which I thought was interesting, just coming back to the healing component, is I like that idea that it's an interaction with the spirit world. So it's the email or the text. Um, there are opportunities to either embed, like if you're drinking the ashes of a fusigil for health, you are kind of embedding a spirit in you, or, and this is one that I hadn't occurred to me, but you were describing in the book, is a kind of yin yang rebalancing.
Yeah, so the idea is it's basically a prescription. The priest would diagnose what the issue is. And the issue would, it kind of, you see this in traditional Chinese medicine, you see this in martial arts as well, meditation. But basically, the idea is okay, you have a problem right now. Why do you have this problem? Is it because of a yin and yang imbalance? Do you have not enough wood in you? Do you have not enough fire, not enough metal? Do you see what I'm saying? So they try to figure out what it is based on sort of the ontological and foundational principles of Taoism. And then they'll craft a sigil that basically is potent with the element or the component that you need.
Gotcha. Now, uh, Fu sigil. So you mentioned the sort of, which I'm a little bit familiar with, the Western sigil method, where you essentially have a statement of intent and then you remove letters, either vowels or repeats or both or so on, and then you create something. So the end object, it does not look like the original letters in English or Cyrillic or whatever you're putting it together in. When it comes to Fu sigils, are they in sort of Mandarin icons? I mean, how do you craft Fu sigils?
Generally, it's in a form of code. So even an everyday person who is absolutely fluent in Mandarin and Chinese and literacy might not be able to recognize it. But I would say there's so many variations and traditions that it's hard to keep track of. So, for example, how you craft food talismans. For one, it's very specific to tradition. So a lot of the more established Eastern mystery traditions will have their own signature, their own sort of trademark almost. Like you can recognize it. For example, if you see a sigil by somebody from the Shangqing or the Zhengye, you can kind of tell what it looks like. So some people have, there's the cloud writing style where the sigils represent sort of are they kind of remind you of clouds. There's the type where you have to write the whole thing in a single breath, and then there's others where it's a channeled script or oracle bone scripts. A lot of the ones you see is based on Chinese oracle bone script that dates back to like the Zhou dynasty.
Yeah, I loved the cloud writing. So obviously, in a funny way, the process is kind of similar because you are turning it from something recognizable into something not recognizable. So
Correct.
with cloud writing, you kind of have your intent or the collection of characters that represent either the spirit or whatever it is you're going to do, and then you kind of draw them as if they were clouds.
Yes, correct.
And it looks, I mean, there's many examples in the book. It's remarkable. It's something I'm certainly going to play with as an idea because I really like that. Uh, I really like that that's an emotive match to how you would um, want sigils to be released from you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And a lot of the Chinese grimoires, the individual practitioners or alchemists, what they'd be is basically a roster of what each of the various codes or components means. So they'd have basically it's a glossary. They would devise their own glossary or it'd be within their tradition or their pai, their sect's tradition to have certain codes and they'd all memorize it. Basically, it's like learning a different language. And that would be codified in their grimoires.
And so let's kind of carry the Fu sigil creation journey on a bit. So if I want to uh, evoke and embed some protective spirits for my family home, uh, let's go through. So we would get the characters that match what we were after.
So for that specific example, a common approach would be to call upon the four directional guardians, so or five. So it depends on tradition. Some say there's four, that sort of correspond with the compass directions, north, south, east, and west, and some say there's five. A lot of practitioners will go with five because five is also the number of guardians that you would call upon for exorcisms or like more hardcore work, so to speak. Whereas the four is more for not lower work, that's not the right word, but just for more practical everyday stuff. But if you're trying to just protect your home and you're not, you don't need to protect it from any like crazy demons or anything like that, then yeah, it would be the north, south, east, and west guardian spirits. And then you'd fill each of the sigils. So you'd craft four different sigils, and each sigil would have sort of symbology related to that particular guardian spirit.
And then the way they're sort of constructed is vertical, is lengthways typically.
Typically, it's lengthwise, and most of them you see will be that way. And the reason for that is because that's how I think it was the Zhengyi, but it was basically no, it was Tianzi, sorry, but it was the very first Taoist lineage that began sort of commodifying food talismans and sort of selling them on the streets. And so they became recognized as the first to really practice food talisman crafting. And that's the way they did it. And so a lot of subsequent traditions, especially solitary or eclectic practitioners, are going to follow that methodology. But specific orthodox lineages will have their own ways and they could run the whole gamut.
Yeah, it's another point that's worth bringing up, which I found fascinating because the traditions are still living, as opposed to European grimoire traditions where there's been many breaks. There are different schools and actual lineages, so it does in fact match things that you're more likely to see in Afro-Caribbean spiritual practices, where you will have different houses and lineages back to different masters who have different ways of constructing the Fu sigils to the point where you can recognize them, but also different kind of schools of best practice.
Yes, that's the right word. Houses or schools. In Chinese, we say pai. I couldn't figure out, like, groups was my best translation. But yes, they're like houses or schools. And each one will have their own traditions and their own orthodox practices. And yeah, it does follow master to master, or it's by inheritance, where it's from father to son or mother to daughter.
And if I am a layperson in Taiwan, and I need some sigils, can I recognize them? Like, do people talk about it the way they talk about sports teams? Like, yes, but this house is better for blah, blah, blah.
In Taiwan, southern Taiwan specifically, I remember there's I think Hongtou, Heito, how do you like red hat and black hat? So there's two specific lineages. I can't remember which is which, but one of them is more sort of specialized in mediumship, exorcisms, and contacting the undead. And the other one is just more for practical everyday stuff like helping your child behave better or getting good grades in school, things like that. So there's sort of two that I kind of know of that people, the lay individual will say, oh, these are the ones to go to.
And it will depend on what you need and what your own interests are. Like, if you're feeling pretty hardcore about house protection, you'll go to the one that deals in necromancy, and you'll get some dead warriors put into Fu sigils around your house.
Right, exactly. Or if you're afraid that you're cursed or something like that, then you'd go to the more hardcore ones.
Right. And one of the other kind of things we can say, or that I learned that I thought was very interesting, because a few bits, which we'll come on to eventually, but a few bits have this filled out a lot of stuff for me around things like using Lo Shu to create sigils just as a Western system, because I think it's the best of the magic squares. But we'll get to that eventually. The just carrying on the Fu sigil construction. So typically lengthwise, but also additional components are augmenting the characters that themselves have been warped. So there's a kind of often you'll build them into a house.
That's the way I sort of deconstructed it because when I was writing the book, I was like, how can I give a how-to explanation of how to construct a sigil or a food talisman to somebody who's not familiar with the culture at all. So when you study massive amounts of food talismans from various sort of looking for common themes, right, across many broad ranging traditions and histories, you could sort of deconstruct it into there is kind of like a house. And a lot of times when you read about what various sigils do, the house kind of follows as like a thesis. It sort of like sets the tone or the subject matter of that particular talisman, right? And then the inside kind of feels like ingredients to a recipe that they're putting together or assembling.
And it's because it's an assembly. Like it will include trigrams and hexagrams from the I Ching, and it's not just it's not simply letters. You're actually compiling things that in that cosmology have very specific energetic signatures, and you're building an assemblage.
It depends. So the more common form of food talisman is actually a mantra or a statement where you have to be literate in Chinese. You have to be able to read and write Chinese, and then they just codify it and into cloud writing or other forms of script. But if I'm trying to teach it to a Western practitioner who can't write Chinese, then the easier way, and this is also one that's practiced within the culture as well, is to go back to the ontological principles of, the heaven, earth, and man, the five elements, the I Ching, 8 trigrams, and of course the magic square. So then I think that's easier for a Western practitioner to construct than to sort of have them try to memorize various mantras and then write it in Chinese, right? So
Yeah, gotcha. And you actually brought up something. This is going to be an interesting question. You've obviously read through loads and loads of historic and contemporary food talismans. But for a book like this, because obviously there's and these are the best books, books that have a kind of pleasing interpersonal journey and payoff involved in their creation. What was day one like? When did you decide, I'm going to have to write a book on food talismans? And what do you do on day one when that happens?
So actually, I began after holistic tarot. I started a book on feng shui, and one of the facets of feng shui practice is feng shui cures, and that means if there's something that's wrong with the sort of setting or environment of your home or office, and you need to cure it, but logistically you can't rearrange or reconstruct the place, you can use food talismans as a feng shui cure. When I was writing that, because that I was very familiar with, that was really part of my family folk practice. But then I realized, I think when I was doing that, sort of an epiphany struck that I lived in an oral tradition and I had already lost all of the knowledge from my grandparents and was sort of kicking myself for that. And at the time I was thinking, well, if I have children and my mom, she's not getting any younger, if I don't start documenting these things, it's going to be lost from my family history forever. So that was when I became really motivated to write down my family history and write down family practices and family knowledge. And before I knew it, as I was documenting, it became quite large. At the time, it was only 50,000 words. The final product is 100,000 words. But at around 50,000 words, I realized I kind of had a book. And at one point, I was having a conversation with a publisher. I brought this up sort of as like a side note because I was still talking about the feng shui book. And they were really interested in this idea. And they're like, well, you already have a full manuscript. Why don't you bring it over? And that's when I decided to develop the 50,000 into 100,000 words, and it became a published book.
Yeah, it's 100,000 words and 500,000 diagrams and pictures and so on. It's extremely, especially because I do not speak any Asian languages. It's I could follow it, and that's definitely saying something if I could follow it. And it's really really fascinating. But I was just trying to. Did you? I wanted to know whether or not you were aware of what you were doing on day one. Like, because it's a remarkable product at the end, the history and the actual practical information, but all the different tables and so on in it. It's I thought, I wonder if she knew what she was getting into on day one.
I don't know if I knew what I was getting into, like what that means, but I can tell you what was in my head. I was writing, I don't have any children, I'm childless, but I was writing for my daughter. So when I was writing it, I was thinking of a daughter who would be born and raised in America and who probably wouldn't be speaking that much Chinese. How can I pass on this tradition to my child? That was how I wrote the
Yeah, well, when that happens, I'm sure it will happen. Because yeah,
book.
it's fantastic. But speaking of books on food talismans, tell us about classics of the esoteric talisman.
Oh, Huang Ti Fuji. It's it's basically this book that anyone growing up in China or Mandarin speaking Chinese diasporas will have heard of, but either might not have read or have read but didn't really understand it. I always make sort of the analogy to maybe Beowulf or reading a classic in Old English. Even if you are fluent in English, modern English, you might not necessarily be able to read that text unless you have sort of the educational or scholarly background to read Old English, or in this case, to read this traditional form of Chinese. It's a text that we really don't know where it came from, so it depends on which scholar you talk to. Some people say it came from the Zhou dynasty. That would dated around, between 1000 to 200 BC. Others say no, that's sort of baloney, and it really can't be documented any earlier than the Han Dynasty, which is still pretty old, 200 BC to 200 AD. Either way, it's this text that's basically um, an anonymous person writing, well, we think it's anonymous person writing about how to work with unseen metaphysical energy, the implications of qi, and the implications of astrology, numerology, and magic in the Chinese sort of mythos.
So it's essentially a grimoire that's a couple of millennia old. That what you find with different diasporas is, and they're not usually as old as that. There's a book. So you have the long lost friend, which came from sort of Low Countries and Central Europe into the US, which is a collection of um, folk magic and herbal cures and so on, and you'll get the different books of Cyprian in the sort of Iberian diaspora. So there's always in both those cases we're only talking a couple of centuries at best, but there seems to be in diasporas like, where's the weird book?
The thing is, I don't know if it would be the right sort of drawing the analogy to grimoire, because there are no correspondences in it, and in this particular book there aren't necessarily any like how to spell crafting. It's more like bullet points of philosophy, like magical philosophy. You know what I'm saying?
I
It's kind
gotcha.
of like yeah, like principles of witchcraft, principles of sorcery, principles of alchemy, but it doesn't actually get into the nitty gritty and logistics of how to do it.
Well, okay, so it'd be if we wanted to match that, then it would be to someone one earlier. But one of the things, the reason I bring it up, because I love this, um, one, and I think this is probably true and also fascinating. But you kind of have a translation of its points in the book, and the thing that I love, and this is very kind of chaos magic in general, but before every event, there are opportunities to trigger change, but only if you get the timing right and the mechanisms are peaceful. So it's this fascinating understanding of what we would in the modern day talk about. Well, if you have assessed your probabilistic outcomes correctly before an event, you can do things to nudge them. But really, once they're in play, try for the next event.
Yeah, and I also find it so empowering. It has so much to do with free will, which is if you have to understand the context of the culture. Chinese culture is by tradition very fatalistic, right? And so to see that in a Chinese text, I thought was very astounding.
Yeah, well, it's the nuance that I think we miss in if we have a free will fate discussion in a European mode, which
Right.
is well, a modern European mode, because you would get the Vikings would probably not describe it like that, but would say something similar, where you have a fate, but you also have agency, and it's a really I love it. It's sort of like it's a very sorcerous and calculating description of how you can participate in the universe, because it's quite clear. It's like, no, you can trigger change before a sequence of events, which from a practical magic point of view is the best time to do it, because it's easier to kind of shift those lower probabilities. Uh,
Right.
and I love that it's 1800-year-old metaphysical advice.
Yeah, that's why I really tried hard to parse through that text and bring it down to its bare principles and essentials, because I found it so rich and so applicable no matter what your own tradition or path is. There's so much philosophy there to reap no matter what your background is.
Well, I mean, yeah. Let's have this then. Benebell, magic, is it sacred? Yes or no?
Wow. I I don't, oh, I don't know. So I approach it with like with a sacred um attitude, like I embody a very sort of sacred understanding of magic and craft. But I think ultimately the way I've explained it in the book, it is, I'm not saying it's science, of course, but you have to approach it with almost that level of scientific rigor, where you do need to be cold and objective and understand sort of the bare essentials and how the metaphysical components fit together with a very scientifically driven mind. And the more logical you are, I think the better you can be at mastering those basic components and putting together in a very versatile and masterful way for craft. So, do you see why it's really hard to answer? I
Yeah.
don't think it's sacred, but I don't know anybody who approaches magic without that sense of it being sacred. You know what I mean? It's that
Yes.
paradox.
And that's kind of in the classics of the esoteric talisman as well, which is it's essentially it's not separate from the universe; it's a natural functioning of it. So it's not supernatural; it's
Yes.
natural.
Exactly. Is gravity sacred? But I think because of the nature of the practice, most of the people who are practitioners are going to approach it with this sort of sacred comportment.
There are towards the back. I mean, we touched on it briefly in Taiwan, but there are different signs for witch and sorcerer and shaman. Do people actually like? Do they hang a shingle out and identify which one? That like, oh no no, you want the shaman, I'm the witch down the road. Are these different kind of social roles, or are these different approaches to magic? And it could be one person, and depending on what it is they're doing at the time, they will use the witchcraft or the sorcery character.
So let's talk about this historically and then modern. Okay. So historically, it was pretty separate in terms of region, province, location, and also socioeconomic class. So, for example, the witch, and I'm talking purely in terms of objective history. Okay. So nobody go down my throat about this. The witch was associated more with lower socioeconomic classes, specifically people who couldn't have access to forms of medicine. Ceremonial magicians and alchemists were associated with higher classes, and a lot of the well-known ceremonial magicians and alchemists, especially the ones who are writing the scriptures, were all government officials, were all part of the noble class or part of the warrior class. And then you had out in the rural countryside, or if you're looking more into Tibetan culture or Mongolian culture, then you have sort of like the village shaman. Then the shamanic culture is more in the rural side. So that's sort of the compartmentalizing of the various titles, historically speaking. And so if you were sort of, on the street level, you were a peasant, but you lived in the cities, you would probably go see a witch for your needs. Or there might be a local Taoist priest. There's a history there. There was a while in history, and this is why there was an overthrow of the government, when Taoist priests, the very highly educated ones, were giving free, basically access to free healthcare to the poor. And so that's why Taoism became very popular. This was during the Qin dynasty and Han dynasty. But I mean, during that time, there was that. But generally speaking, they were pretty separate. And now today in modern practice, it reflects a lot of the New Age movements in the West as well, where like a lot of people are just using various titles like willy-nilly, and you can't really separate one from the other. You know what I'm saying? Like there's random
Yep.
people just calling themselves a shaman, and you're like, what? So it's really
Yeah.
hard to say what's going on in the modern culture, but it's all mixed together in the big cities. They just use whatever name they want.
Gotcha.
So it's hard to say.
So, just historically, then, the witch and the shaman were you would go to if you were poor, essentially, and the witch may have more practical treatments. Would the shaman? So, the shaman, if you're out in the villages or in the countryside, would he or she do what we would consider shamanic stuff? Would it be like spirit
I don't
journeying
know.
and that kind of thing?
They would. I don't know. It would be poor though, because in the village, the noble class within that sort of village in the rural parts would also go to the
Gotcha.
shaman, and the shaman would be sort of linked with the king. So do you see what I'm saying? But then like you're talking about a village of like what, 12 people.
Yeah.
So
But
right?
like the
But then
shaman's job was actually shamaning, if you will. Like it was to talk to spirits, go to the other world, and that's it's a separate role to. Okay, so let me have another crack at this then. Rich,
yeah.
go to the witch if you're poor. Go to the sorcerer or be a sorcerer if you are of a noble class, and go to the shaman for all your needs, depending on and it's kind of class irrelevant,
Roughly, yes. Roughly, yes.
roughly. Yeah. I think that's it's interesting to see where these roles. It's interesting to see how these roles and duties are passed, where the similarities are, and where the differences are. Looking at sort of spirit traditions and living traditions around the world, because I think it says something quite important that there is, in fact, although there are certainly differences, there is in fact a discernible rough shape on planet Earth of how uh, kind of cultures build roles that are dealing with the spirit world, and I find that very fascinating.
Absolutely, me too. And that's another reason I felt more encouraged to publish this book for the Western audience, because I found so much common ground and there is such a strong common denominator that you really can't ignore it. People who are, more interested in having conversations about cultural appropriation, all of that might overlook it, but I think it's hard to ignore that common denominator. And I think it's so fascinating and important for us to talk at the level of the common denominator, because that's really what's going to bring us all together in solidarity.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the cultural appropriation thing because this year in particular, we've had guests on the show that have been talking about Latin American and Mexican, spiritual and folk practices. Same thing for Tibet. Same thing for kind of around the world. We're making it more of this kind of global discussion now, and you actually have a chapter on. Appropriation, and I think this is definitely where the discussion is at in 2017. Like, where do we draw the line between learning from and being inspired by other cultures, which is to be heartily encouraged, and what is appropriation? So when do you take that too far?
Um, I
By the
think,
way, if you solve this, congratulations, because I ask everyone this. And the reason
yeah,
we're having the discussions is because like we don't know yet.
right. So I think that's a very important disclaimer upfront, is that we're also working toward that answer. So everything we all say is sort of, hypothesis at this point. But in terms of my personal opinion, I would say when you take it out of the context of the culture that the relic was born into, you change the context, you change the meaning for something that's more self-interested, oftentimes, money driven or commercialization, then I think we run into issues, especially when you get into, for example, treating people's sacred artifacts as fashion statements. That becomes pretty problematic.
Yeah, so this brings me up. I actually have this in my most recent book. Like, I have a rant about appropriation, which, funnily enough, the magical world doesn't do that much of it. Because if you take the object out of its context, you break it. I don't want a broken object. I want the object to be magical. Monoculture certainly does. So you'll see people, um, you know, at music festivals wearing First Nations headdresses that shouldn't. That's appropriation. That is. But you don't see anyone like. Well, I certainly don't see anyone at like magical gatherings doing that, and I
Right.
think that's the bit people have been, and rightly so. People have been overly sensitive in the magical world about appropriation, but there is learning to be had, and this is something actually my publisher Peter Gray brought up as well. There hasn't been a time in Magic's history where it hasn't been a thief, when it
Yeah.
hasn't been there learning. So weirdly, that kind of um, constantly mutating learning mode is magic.
Look at Taoism. Integrated into the culture of Taoist sorcery is, they pull from Hinduism, they pull from Buddhism, which is why a lot of people can't tell the difference between Buddhism and Taoism, right? They pull from Shintoism, they pull from whichever, especially the Chinese diasporas. Once they leave the mainland, wherever they go, they pick up sort of the relics from the culture around them and embed it into Chinese or Taoist sorcery. So Taoist magic by its very nature is very eclectic. It's very much about mixing and matching different cultures and different religions as well. So I don't think you can really talk about cultural appropriation in that sense, but also understand that both sides are learning. The reason a lot of marginalized or minority cultures get so sensitive is because of our experiences. Do you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Like, I grow up in this culture where I'm constantly being targeted for how I look, my culture. I feel like I have to whitewash myself. And my culture is a form of why people might treat me different in a negative way. And then when people from the more privileged culture use it in a way that uplifts them, there's an envy. And really, the ugly word is that there is that sense of envy. And so I think privileged cultures need to be very sensitive and compassionate about where that anger and where that hostility is coming from. And if we can sort of work toward that compassion, then there's going to be a level of understanding reached by both sides, I believe.
Yeah, I think so, and it's absolutely the right way of thinking about it. That you're taking something from an already marginalized group to lift yourself up. And you go, well, you've just made the gap bigger. What have you just done?
So from a magical, objective, magical perspective, that's what you should be doing, right? But just have an understanding of why another culture might feel upset. And I would even argue, like, there's, in a sense, it's unreasonable to be upset, but there is still a good political reason, a good social political reason for why they're upset. So understanding that social politics that really can't be excised from, the craft, then we'll be able to sort of have the same conversations.
And potentially magical laws too. I mean, classics of the esoteric talisman. You can't trigger those changes unless your mechanisms are peaceful. So
Right,
it may not even work.
right, exactly.
One of the things. So let's give an example of this because I think. At least with the private members, and we sort of do a weekly video Q&A. What is happening is that we're kind of evolving a way of doing this. Like how do we learn in a way that doesn't leave, that is a sort of leave only footprints, take only photographs experience of non-Northwest European magical cultures. And I think you have a very good example in there when you're talking about energy amplification, because rather than five phases, the same advice can be mapped to the kind of classical Greek or alchemical elements.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so maybe we should, do you want to talk through that for people listening?
Um, well, what I wanted to do is sort of teach people how to fish instead of giving them fish in a sense. So I didn't want to write a book that had like sort of step by step instructions on how to craft this, how to craft that. I wanted to give you the philosophy behind craft using Chinese Taoist vocabulary and hope that that inspires new insights or understandings of your own path. Or you can take parts of that philosophy and integrate it into your path. So, for example, the idea is that, we have atoms, that what you see isn't really all that is there. What you see as one thing is not one, but many, many little micro parts, right? And science understands this. So, in a metaphysical perspective, those many little parts would probably be forms of elements, forms of components. In the traditional Western perspective would be the fire, water, air, and earth. So you can use that instead of the 5 elements or the 5 phases of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water if it makes more sense for you. And so that's sort of where I was going with that. I thought it was interesting too that there's this idea of numerology and the magic squares that sort of combine as a nexus for magicians to work with in both the Western and Eastern traditions. And so I wanted to talk about the history of the Taoist magic square. I don't know whether or not the Western magic square people can trace the lineage of that back, but there's a very clear history with the Lo Shu, and so I wanted to talk about that in the book.
Oh no, I can trace it back, and I have traced it back, and
Oh,
we
cool.
appropriated it about 2,000 years ago from China. So, so you're
Nice.
actually talking for people listening. It's like, oh, can I use Taoist magic squares? I'm like, I got news for you. You already
You
are.
make use. Oh, neat. Okay, well then.
Yeah, I've been doing sort of the Western sigil stuff at a very public level, I guess you could say, for a number of years, and so I'm a big fan of the Lo Shu design. And actually, let's talk about that. Let's talk Lo Shu.
Okay.
So let's get the story of it. Its origin, which is why I like it.
Well, it's mythology, first of all, but it's this idea that Fuxi, a shamanic emperor who, of course, you're only an emperor because the heavens and the gods in heaven, ordained you as such, right? So you have magical powers and all that. And so a prophecy was sort of formed in front of Fuxi, and that was on a tortoise shell. And according to myth, the tortoise shell was broken up in these 9 parts, and in each sector were spots, either dark spots or light spots, in such a way that the emperor saw it as representing the organization of the universe. And so the original Lo Shu also fits into the early heaven Bagua. And it's this idea of the numbers 1 through 9 being the foundation of magic, numerology, metaphysics, all of that stuff, and how these 9 numbers fit into this square. And if you could work with this square, the magic square of numbers, then you could control any energy or element in the universe. Basically, you could become a practitioner of magic. And all of the numbers equal 15 because in Daoism, 15 is this like really special number. It represents, the 5 elements multiplied by the 3, heaven, earth, and the Trinitarian principle, heaven, earth, and man. And so there's all of these sort of mystical associations with the number 15, which is why it's considered a magic square.
But it is it's a shaman emperor.
Yes.
Getting a tool to kind of describe all of the universe from a magical turtle. It's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, so the story goes, right?
And in the book, there's sort of very clear sort of guidance as how you can actually use that to create your own sigils, because using English letters or numbers or so on. And I think it's a remarkable way, particularly if you do sort of experimental spirit work in the Western tradition, where you are dealing with spirits who maybe don't have a sigil. You can you have off the back of a magical turtle a way of generating it. And that's one of the ways it's kind of I've used it historically. But the Lo Shu magic square is definitely my favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. Even, I mean, I always think that the mythology is fun, but looking at it objectively, I mean, you can intuit that there's something there to it. The mathematical precision of it right there is fascinating, and how the various structures, like they can fit astrology, the I Ching, and numerology, all of the various components of the elements, all into this magic square. And it works whether you're using a Western construct or an Eastern construct. So That right there, I find
and it is older than, much older than European attempts to do the same thing. So there's been a number, the sort of famous ones, Kabbalah, for instance, so, dealing with 1000 AD, or the sort of natural magic that you get around Agrippa, where they're trying to put everything together into a system of either Greek or Hebrew letters, and, having the kind of classic fold-out grimoire, if you will. This is thousands of years old.
Yeah, it's dated back to, so archaeologists and historians date it back to the Neolithic period of China, and that's between 10,000 BC and 2000 BC.
So we talk about mythology in a post-Cartesian way here, where it's not something. Mythology doesn't mean untrue; it means eternally true. That's sort of paraphrasing Tolkien. But even without that, you're dealing with a hugely sophisticated cultural object at a time depth that shouldn't be there. So it is weird. It's a weird thing to exist.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Oh, and also Fuxi used the magic square to explain that the universe is constantly expanding, that the universe is a spiral. So he drew a spiral from the magic square and theorized that the universe is expanding at a rate of, it was like 8% to 10%. Oh, 1 to 9, whatever 1 to 9 is. I'm so bad at math for an Asian. But basically, he said our universe is expanding at that ratio of 1 to 9. And I believe very recently, we knew for a while since Hubble that the universe is expanding from a scientific perspective, but it was very recently that the actual number or measure that we came up with was close to that 1 to 9 ratio. Look it up, science.
Yeah, everyone loves science. It's that's kind of the sort of further evidence. Across the world, you get these magical objects or magico-cultural objects, such as those two words are different, that genuinely make you, and it's not a problem for me, I ascribe to the spirit model, but they genuinely make you go, there's something else going on here, because that shouldn't be. That shouldn't be in a materialist explanation.
Yep.
Speaking of spirals, one of the other things which I learned from this book, and have already, because I only finished it last week, but I've already had cause to use, is the 6 spiral maze.
Oh, yeah,
Why I did, and this, so for people, actually, no, Benebell, you describe it, and I'll describe what it reminded me of.
You mean the He2 spiral sequence?
Yes, so the one that kind of, I'll do it anyway, like the one that kind of is used to distract spirits.
Oh, well, it depends on the tradition, I guess. So there's this idea that, if you go in, if you do some form of craft in spirals, that somehow the spirits can become disoriented, and so they can't do the harm or the malice that they want. And this actually translates into feng shui. So in feng shui, you'll see that people don't like angles, or they don't like straight lines. They like sort of that curved path. And one of the ideas for that, or reasoning behind that, is that the curved path will confuse bad spirits. And so there's that idea in magic.
So in kind of English cunning traditions, there are ways you can essentially banish the devil, and you don't really banish the devil, because the devil is a thing that exists, and so it doesn't really, it's a thing God created. You can't get rid of it, but you can send it on chores that will take a long time. So you can banish the devil by sending it to do things like count every grain of sand on a beach, or count every leaf in a forest. And it's the same magical thinking that is underlying the sort of spiral maze, which is, I can't stop you. You're a thing that exists in the universe, but I can slow you up.
Right, the spiral, the circle, yeah, that's sort of a core principle as well when you get into some of the darker stuff. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I thought so. I think it's anyway. It's a remarkable book. I had a lot of fun reading through it. As I said, it really filled out a lot of gaps, and I highly recommend it. But for people who obviously they want to know more, Benebell, where do they go to find out more about you?
You can go to my website, benebellwen.com. I'm pretty active on social media, so I think, if you want to, you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter, Bellwen and Tarot Analysis, respectively.
Nice one. And this will, of course, all be in the show notes.
Cool.
All right. And thank you once again. Congratulations on the book. I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Gordon.
How do you like that then? Magic turtles, possessed uncles, writing scripts that demons fear, and a little light tarot to boot. Those premium members doing the Sigil course may want to reward yourselves for completing the homework with a copy of the Tao of Craft. If you can thread the appropriation needle with sensitivity, then there is a lot of useful stuff in there. It's also a great book in its own right, of course. Speaking of things that are great in their own right, subscribing to podcasts in iTunes or your favorite podcatcher certainly is that. Let me know what you think of the show at runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page, or find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.